Okay. Uh, all right. So George Berkeley. Uh, as I'm sure I mentioned before, it is pronounced Barkley, even though it's spelled Berkeley. Even though, therefore, the city I live in should be called Barkley, but all right. 1685 to 17. And the book we're written, book we're reading, usually called The Principles, was published in 1710. So when he was 25 years old. So, and this is 20 years after Locke published the essay concerning human understanding. Right? That was 1790. And it's 6 years after Locke's death. So we've moved somewhat farther in time. He was Anglo-Irish. It is he so Berkeley, actually, I found this out by looking at Wikipedia yesterday. Berkeley is an ancient English noble family, and it still exists. And it's one of the few families that can trace itself to back before the Norman conquest. So he came from a long line of English, I mean, not like major, but English nobility. But he was born in Ireland. He was born in a castle in Ireland. Um, why was he born in a castle in Ireland? Because England was occupying Ireland. So, so that's why, I mean, to call him a British empiricist is maybe not strictly speaking true. He was born in Ireland and he lived a lot of his life in Ireland, but he was really English. Um, um, so when he published the Principles, he was still in Ireland. He was a pretty young man. After that, he spent time in England, in Europe, in Ireland again. It was only later when he came back to Ireland again that became an Anglican priest. Um, and much later, well, I guess not that much later, but 1734, he was made Bishop of Cloyne, meaning like the Anglican bishop, or I guess technically he was a bishop in the Church of Ireland. But the Church of Ireland is like the Anglican Church in Ireland. So, so even though like you'll often hear him referred to as Bishop Berkeley, he wasn't a bishop or even a priest yet when he wrote this. Um, After he was in Ireland again, he went to America and he stayed in Rhode Island. I used to be confused about this. So he had plans to found a college in Bermuda. I always used to think he went to Bermuda and waited there, but actually he went to Rhode Island and waited while like the funding was supposed to come through from Parliament in England. And he waited for a while in Rhode Island and it never came through. And so he went back to England. So I mean, while he was in Rhode Island, that's when he owned slaves. Because he like, I guess, rented a plantation while he was in Rhode Island or something. And the thing to do was to have slaves. So he did that. Um, so I don't know why I'm laughing. It's serious, but um, uh, is that is that relevant to his philosophy? I think, well, so his practical philosophy, which we're not reading in this course, was extremely conservative. It's basically like the thesis is that you're never allowed to disobey the government no matter what. So there can never be a legitimate reason for rebelling against the government. Um, I guess that goes pretty well with being comfortable with slavery. um, but in terms of the philosophy we're reading, I mean, uh, um, there's nothing obvious, but there's a little thing about the concept of human being, the supposed abstract idea of human being. And one of his objections to it is that it would have to have a color, but the color could be neither white nor black nor tawny nor any other color. Right. And that's just an example of why he thinks you can't form general ideas like that right across the board. So it's um, and I guess, I mean, as you can tell by the term tawny there, he does mean it's not like in Aristotle when they say Socrates is white, Socrates is black, where it's something that changes from one time to another. And I don't know exactly what it means, but it's not what it's not about race. But presumably in Berkeley, that is about race. Um, but I don't know how to go any farther with that. Um, anyway, right. So after that, he moved back. After he moved back to England, then back to Ireland. He returned to Ireland when he was made Bishop of Cloyne. Cloyne is in Ireland, I guess. I don't know where Cloyne is. And and he stayed there until he retired in 1752, and then he died in Oxford in 1753. Um, and he did write more books after this. So, I mean, this book, so the full title is A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, which, I mean, fortunately we call it the principles because like that's the only word in it that isn't in the title of the other books we're reading. Right? Like these people all wrote books that had almost the same title. Um, uh, so right, she published this book and another book about vision around the same time, and then he published other things later, um, including this thing he published late in his life about the virtues of tar water, which I read, and it's kind of weird, but it doesn't actually. I was hoping it would throw some light on how he thought about the same things in this book later, but it doesn't really go into them. It does talk about the Trinity and all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't really go back to the question of idealism. So, um, anyway, so this book, The Principles, is supposed to have two parts. The first part was going to be about ideas, and that's the part we have. And the second part was going to be about ethics and free will, and therefore about spirits. Um, so Berkeley claimed that he actually wrote a lot of part two, but he lost the manuscript while he was traveling in Italy, and he was too frustrated to write it again. So, so the book as we have it, this is kind of weird. It has an introduction and part one. And those are the two parts of the book. It doesn't have any other parts after part one. Um, uh, okay. There are other things I could say about Berkeley. Maybe they'll come up as I'm talking. He feels to me not as likable as Locke or Hume. Um, everyone loved Hume, apparently, except except Rousseau when he got paranoid that Hume was plotting against him, but with his mother-in-law. But anyway, um, but Berkeley, yeah, I mean, and the weird thing is, like, one thing that puts me off is the way he talks about children in the reading for today. Um, But it's weird because of the three people we're reading, he's the only one who actually had children. He had lots of children. I don't know exactly how many, but there's a like portrait of him with his family somewhere you can see online with all these children and grandchildren. Um, but he doesn't seem to have paid attention the way Locke did. Um, all right. In any case, that's all I have to say about Berkeley as a person. Are there any questions about that? Yes.
I was here, um, wondering if he was influenced by Irish culture related to Ireland, or was he like isolated from it, or was he?
I don't know. I mean, so obviously he wasn't completely isolated from it, right? Like he didn't, um, he went to college there. He went to a Protestant college, obviously, but he went to college there and, uh, but I don't know. He certainly has no sympathy for Catholicism, if anything less than Locke. Um, um, but like I don't know, like shamrocks or something. I have no idea. I guess maybe I don't know enough about Irish culture to answer the question. Um, uh, but no, I mean, it's pretty clear in this book, and I think this is a little bit different with some of the things he wrote later, but it's pretty clear in this book that his overwhelming influence is Locke, right? I mean, he's always talking to Locke. Um, so it's perfect for this course. um, uh, yeah, sometimes he mentions Descartes. Sometimes he mentions quote unquote schoolmen. Um, apparently, like these are people he knew. So I don't know if that's possibly an influence of being in Ireland but he also traveled in Europe. I don't know. Okay, so like what's going on overall in this book is that um, right, so Berkeley starts by saying, when we leave common sense behind, um, and try to think more carefully, you would think that that would lead us to expand our knowledge, but in fact, it leads us into what he calls uncouth paradoxes. um, and he says, how can that be? Like, how could it be that using your reason and thinking carefully, that whereas people who don't think very hard are fine, people who use their reason and think carefully end up in uncouth paradoxes? What's going on? And he says, and here already he's arguing against Locke, or takes himself to be arguing against Locke. He says, it can't be because the faculties God has given us are defective, like that they're not suitable for the questions we're trying to answer, which that basically is Locke's answer, right? I mean, maybe you would have seen that more if maybe I should have signed the introduction as a letter to the reader or whatever. But I mean, right, Locke's answer is there's limits to our knowledge. We have to know what the limits to our knowledge are. And even though there's lots of things outside those limits we would like to know, and that other created intellects probably do know, nevertheless, our faculties aren't sufficient for it, right? They've been given to us for the purpose of, taking care of ourselves in this life and the next, and nothing beyond that. So we just have to accept the fact that there's some things we can't think about, and then we try to think about them, we'll get into trouble. And that, in some sense, following Locke, that's also going to be Kant's answer to that question. But Berkeley is saying that can't be the right answer. I mean, roughly speaking, because God is not a deceiver. I mean, the God is not a deceiver argument didn't really play much role in Locke, if any. For what people who weren't in 100B, maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. Right? In Descartes' meditations, a lot hangs on proving that God is not a deceiver and then explaining what that means I can't go wrong about. So Berkeley is using a version of that argument here, right? He's saying God couldn't have given us a desire to know things and given us faculties that will get us into trouble when we try to know them. Um, so our reason is good enough to think carefully about things and to get beyond common sense. Um, but we get into trouble because we use it wrong. So, I mean, there's this weird thing, right? Berkeley says we try to blame it on our faculties, but it's actually our fault. Which is like when you first hear it, it sounds a little bit weird. Like, what do you mean? My faculties are me. What do you, yeah. But I think the point is, faculties are like powers or capacities to do something. And what our will does is actualize them, right? Like bring them into act. And the faculties can be good, but if my will is wrong, then I'll use them the wrong way. And that's my fault, right? I mean, the faculties aren't my fault. I didn't give them to myself, but the way I use them is my fault. Um, so we're using them wrong. And what does it mean that we're using them wrong? Not that we're making like blunders in deduction from one step to the next. Um, um, for example, mathematicians, Berkeley agrees, their proofs are really good. They're really good at following the proof to the exact conclusion that it leads to. But the problem is where we start, right? The problem is we start with false principles. And that's another reason why, of all the words in the title, principles is the right one to call this book. Right? Because Berkeley's claim here is that the reason we get into all kinds of trouble when we think about philosophy is that we know how to use reason correctly, but we use it starting with the wrong principles. And therefore, the farther we go, the worse it gets. Right? Like you start with false axioms, you can prove all kinds of theorems, but each one's going to be worse than the last. um, And there are two main false principles, and they both involve, in this, so to come back to the relationship between philosophy and common sense, like you could say they both involve the same kind of mistake in trying to move beyond common sense. That was like a very broad description of what these two principles, false principles, have in common. But more specifically, they both involve, so to speak, attributing to the understanding an impossible power to free itself from the senses. Right. So there's a kind of philosophical arrogance involved here, right? Like it's when I said it's a defect, it's a problem with my will. I think for Berkeley, that's very serious. Remember, that was true, that was serious for Locke too, right? Like he said how making disputation important was like serving the self-interest of the disputers, but not the public utility. So I mean, but in Berkeley, this is a more like I don't know, intimate criticism. It's not like this is bad for everyone. It's like this is arrogance. This is like hubris. right? You realize that common sense maybe needs some care, and you can't just jump to the conclusions the way we usually do. But you decide that since you're the one who've noticed that, you have like special powers that other people don't have. And you establish that as principles, and then from there on, you're on the wrong track. So, what are the two false principles? Um, so the first one is, um, and this one is about ideas, basically. And this is, the first one is attributing to the understanding the power to abstract from particular ideas, right? So the principle is that like we have abstract general ideas. Um, so you see why I say that this is like a way that the understanding frees itself from the senses, right? Like what the senses reveal is only particulars. But supposedly the understanding can go beyond that by abstraction to make these general ideas. Um, and in the introduction, Berkeley argues that that's a mistake. And obviously, you can see right away why this is an attack on Locke. And I mean, he actually quotes Locke. Like, it's not, you don't have to guess that it's an attack on Locke. He says, like, one of the most able proponents of these abstract ideas, and he quotes Locke, but like he never quotes anyone else. Or he says, like, it is agreed on all hands that X, Y, and Z, which he said is like an expression he likes. Usually agreed on all hands means that Locke agrees. Like he's not actually doing a survey of the history of philosophy here. All right, so anyway, that's the one false principle. And the other false principle, and this is what part one is about. I wonder if part two would have had another false principle. And what would it have been? Probably free will. I'm not sure. Anyway, something about free will. But okay, but so this one is basically about propositions, like the constituents of knowledge. And it's the power to the power that we think the understanding has, but which according to Berkeley is impossible, is the power to infer or even just suppose, like for the sake of argument, a secondary external object beyond my idea, right? Beyond the immediate object, which is the idea. So, so that as we believe we can know or at least think something about external objects that are not our ideas. Um, so, right. So Berkeley says we don't have either of these powers. And again, he says, like, this isn't a limitation of human reason. Right? Like, so, I mean, Locke, of course, will talk about lots of powers we don't have. But then he'll say, but, probably some angels do have this power. He often has a little aside about that. But according to Berkeley, we don't have these powers because these powers are absurd and impossible. They don't make any sense. And so Berkeley says, no one has ever really believed in these because you can't really believe something absurd. Um, I mean, Is that obvious? But so like, in other words, there's a self-contradiction involved in both of these. And Berkeley is saying you can't really believe that a contradiction is true. So, well, it's so hard to say. I was going to ask something like, would contemporary philosophers agree with this? But certainly some of them wouldn't agree with it because some of them say that contradictions are true. So I don't know, but anyway, so but the way Berkeley but it's the way most people traditionally understand it is that a proposition that contradicts itself really fails to express anything that could be true. Right? It's as Kant would say, it's formally invalid. Um, so, right. So Berkeley says no one has really ever believed these because there's nothing there that makes sense to believe. But people, uh, for various reasons, various people who think of themselves as being elevated above common sense pretend that to believe that they have these powers. And in that they succeed in deceiving others and at least sometimes also themselves, right? So they've actually convinced themselves that they have these powers. And certainly I don't think Berkeley thinks Locke is lying, but he thinks Locke has like talked himself into believing in something that really doesn't make any sense. Talked himself into believing that he can believe something that he can't really believe, basically. Um, so, I mean, now, like when you think about the contents of these, and like imagine Berkeley going back to the common sense person, as as at least rhetorically he does, right? And saying, look, I'm on your side. These highfalutin philosophers think they have these powers and whatever, but between you and me, they know like there's no such thing. So, like with this one, I think you can imagine the common sense person being like, yeah, okay, yeah, these weird abstract ideas. Who knows what that is? Philosophers pretend they have something like that. Um, so yeah, Berkeley, you're right. What there really is just idea, just particular ideas, sense images, right? Like, and they're kind of like echoes. But then when you get to this one, it's going to be a hard sell, right? Because you go to the common sense person and you say, and by the way, these philosophers also think there's like such things as like a table that's not in my mind. And we common sense people know that's absurd, right? And the common sense person is going to be like, what? Right. So, I mean, so Berkeley um, tries hard to explain why, although the the words he's using to express it are going to strike the common sense person as bizarre, the thing he's saying is something they really actually believe. That's going to be his claim. Um, but we'll talk more about that next time because next time we're going to talk about part one, whereas now we're talking about the introduction. Okay, are there questions about, that's kind of the general framework for the book. Now we're going to talk about abstract ideas and whatever. So there are questions about that before I go on? Okay. Um, so, so the problem about abstraction is somehow related to whether we can consider apart what in nature is always blended. I mean, I'm saying it's somehow related to that because without being able to figure out yet exactly what he means by it, you can just tell from what Berkeley says that he connects those two things. Right? So, like, the reason abstraction is impossible um, is that abstraction would involve separating what is always blended in reality. Can I say reality? Reality means thingness, and I'm going to be talking about thing really soon. So, I mean, I think it's probably basically the right word, but maybe I should say in nature. I think that's what Berkeley at first says. So, wait, I brought the wrong book. Okay. That's okay. Wait, does someone have an extra? Yes. This doesn't have my little marks in the margin, but that'll be okay. So introduction, section 7 on page 9 starts. It is agreed on all hands, there's that expression I mentioned. It is agreed on all hands that the qualities or modes of things do never really exist, each of them apart by itself. Oh, so he does say really. Do never really exist, each of them apart by itself and separated from all others, but are mixed, as it were, and blended together, several in the same object. So the allusion appears to be to a passage in Locke that I kept emphasizing, and I kept emphasizing it, of course, in part because, like, I already knew it was going to be the first thing I talked about when we got to Berkeley. So, and this is in the essay, book 2, chapter 2, section 1 on page 121. 121 is one of the pages that's, oh, here it is. Huh. Though the qualities that affect our senses are, in the things themselves, so united and blended, there is no separation, no distance between them. That's how it starts. So, like, apparently that's what he's alluding to. I mean, in this case, there isn't actually a footnote, as there is in many cases, but apparently he's alluding to this very section, right? The qualities, or modes of things, blended. It's the same word. So I think he's alluding to this very passage in Locke. But remember, the passage in Locke ends. Yet 'tis plain the ideas they produce in the mind enter by the senses simple and unmixed. So, so there, and I guess maybe I should have read the end of the passage in Berkeley. But we are told the mind being able to consider each quality singly or abstracted from those other qualities with which it is united, does by that means frame to itself abstract ideas. And that's what Berkeley is going to say we can't do, right? So there's ideas, there's qualities or modes that are blended in reality, in the thing itself. Actually, I shouldn't even draw them this way. The whole point is that you can't draw them this way, right? Like if you try to draw the shape and the color of the snowball, you just draw one picture. You can't draw the shape over here and the color over here. They're blended. They can't be separated in reality. So, so it is agreed in all hands, Berkeley is saying, that that's true in the thing. But then he's saying, my opponent, that is Locke, thinks that the mind can separate these from each other and make abstract ideas. Yeah.
Berkeley, if you're unable to separate things, into the different parts that it consists of, what point is there, or could you even think of it as something of combined parts? Wouldn't it just be unity?
Well, there are different ways of thinking about the same unity, I think basically is what he says. But like, we haven't got yet to the, I mean, let me get to the, because I'm trying to figure out what it is that Berkeley says we can't do, that Locke says we can do. And then we can worry about what Berkeley thinks we can do, right? So, so remember when I talked about this passage in Locke, I emphasize that in Locke, the place that the qualities are blended is in the thing. There's qualities, and I draw them like this, kind of next to each other, but they're just qualities of the same thing. Right? This same thing has the power to cause me to perceive different ideas. And then, so Locke says in the thing they're blended, but they enter the mind simple and unmixed. Now we say they enter the mind, of course the qualities don't enter the mind, right? That would mean that the mind becomes cold and white and spherical. The qualities don't enter the mind, but the corresponding ideas are perceived by the mind. And Locke says they're simple and unmixed to begin with. And like, remember that led to the whole discussion of like, so wait, aren't these already abstract? And I had to try to explain what Locke actually thinks the operation of abstraction is, essentially. It's not just any separation of ideas makes for abstraction. But the point I'm making now is according to Locke, the separation of the things that are blended together in the object, which again is not yet the operation of abstraction according to Locke, but it's the separation, right? The separation of what was blended in the object. I mean, again, it's not literally that these qualities that are blended in the object are separated somewhere else. Their effects are separated. And their effects are separated not in the mind because they already come in simple and unmixed. Where are the effects separated? Well, the effects are separated by the sense organs. Right? So this, according to Locke, happens in the body. The snowball has an effect on my eye. And my eye is like a specialized detector, right? Like it only responds to certain aspects of things. So, whereas, you know, the snowball also, if I'm touching it, has an effect on my hand. Those are two different effects. And eventually, by whatever this mysterious connection is, those things get to my brain and then somehow cause my mind to perceive two different simple ideas, white and cold. But they were already separated before they were in my mind. They were separated at the point where there was one effect on my eye and another effect on my hand. Is that clear so far? No? Yeah.
I mean, what about like two qualities that both affect the same sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually what Locke goes on to discuss in that paragraph, right? He says, even if it comes through the same, but you know, but I think Locke would agree with this. You know, it's something in the sense organ or farther along, nevertheless separates those, right? You know, so like I mean, he had no idea how this actually works. We actually know a lot about how it works. But yeah, so, you know, as we would say, somewhere like behind the retina is a cell that only right? A neuron that only responds to edges. That's the way it's like wired, you know? So if this thing has an edge, it has an effect on that neuron different from its effects on other neurons. So again, like Locke doesn't know about neurons and whatever, but it's not that far from what he thinks is happening in here, right? Like little bodies are moving, and so right, and similarly in the hand, you know, you feel both cold and solidity, but it's different aspects of the organ that respond to cold and respond to solidity. Right. So now, of course, all of this, even though we don't know this yet, so to speak, because we haven't gotten to part one yet, all of this down here is going to be what Berkeley denies exists. So, I mean, obviously, Berkeley doesn't think this is the right picture. So the question is, like, so what does Berkeley, so in other words, what Berkeley and Locke have to actually disagree about is Berkeley has to think that there's some ideas that don't enter the mind simple and unmixed. That is, Berkeley and Locke have to actually disagree about some particular ideas. Berkeley must think that in the mind to begin with, there's just one idea where Locke thinks there should be two. So that, like, the disagreement about abstraction really is secondary to that. It's the reason that abstraction is impossible, according to Berkeley, is because there really aren't two different ideas here. If there were two different ideas, of course we could separate them. And and you could tell that, so this is getting ahead of the reading, but it comes up very near the beginning of part one. Right, so first he has a list of all the different kinds of like ideas we get by different senses. By sight, I have the ideas of light and colors, blah, 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 blah. And then as several of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name and so to be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence, having been observed to go together, are accounted one distinct thing, signified by the name apple. Right, so these ideas are because remember, so in the sense that Locke and almost everyone else believes in things, Berkeley doesn't believe in things. But he does think there are things. So what are things? They're a kind of idea. And what we know to begin with is, just from what I just read, is that they're a kind of idea, in generally speaking, that collects different ideas together because we've often found them to go together. Right? So we call this, so like there's a color and a smell and a taste and a consistence. And we've often found them together. So when they come together, we can collect them into one thing and we call that idea apple. And remember, like, it's not the idea of an apple. That's what an apple is. But like, hold on a second. I mean, it's not true that these ideas are inseparably blended. I can taste an apple without seeing it. Right? I can smell an apple without tasting it, et cetera, et cetera. And Berkeley even gives examples like that. Again, near the very beginning of book 1. So what I just read was book 1, section 1. This is book 1, section 5. And he's giving examples of, so he says, I may indeed divide in my thoughts or conceive apart from each other those things which perhaps I never perceived by sense so divided. Thus, I imagine the trunk of a human body without the limbs, right? So here's one kind of quote unquote abstraction that Berkeley is agreeing we can do. You know, I've always seen the trunk of a human body with limbs attached to it, let's say. That's hopefully. And, you know, so I've always seen the trunk of a human body with limbs attached to it, but I can conceive that is imagine a trunk of a human body without the limbs attached. And he says, yeah, if you want to call that abstraction, sure, I can do that. But that's not what we mean by abstraction. And I mean, I think so far in that example, I mean, is it or isn't it? It's certainly not the main kind of example we have in mind when we think about abstraction. But then here's the second example. Or conceive the smell of a rose without thinking on the rose itself. Now, I mean, what does the rose itself mean here? So, like, apparently it means the visual rose. Like, that is when in this, throughout this book, Berkeley seems to talk as if the like primary ideas of things are their visible ideas, which is weird, both because, I mean, sorry, primary, not in a technical sense, although it's related to the technical sense maybe. But it's weird both because you might think that that like the tangible qualities are more essential to things or something like that, but also because that's the point of that book about vision that Berkeley published around the same time he published this, right? Like the whole point of it is that we don't really see. We think that we see shapes of the same kind that we feel, but actually what we see and we feel are totally different. And the seen things are just like signs that advise us that the felt things might come soon. Right? So it's like a language God uses. So like in that book, as Berkeley says here somewhere, in that book, he didn't go into the fact that the felt things are really just ideas too. So he just like takes it for granted that the tangible things are real things, and then he says, you know, so what happens is I get used to receiving certain visual sensations as I'm moving, and I get to expect that if I have those sensations and I go a little bit farther, I'll feel something. And that's why I start to like associate them, the visual sensations with the tangible sensations, but they're really totally unrelated. Like an arbitrary language that God uses to warn me or to advise me what tangible, what touch sensations I may have if I move in different directions. All right, so I mean, so that's weird, but it's weird that, as I said, in this book, he nevertheless usually seems to talk as if it's the visible thing that's essential, right? But I think that's what he means here. If not, you know, you could say it's the tangible rose. But anyway, it says the rose itself. But again, that can only mean like some part of my idea of the rose. There isn't anything else. So like he says, you know, I can conceive the rose itself without, or the smell of the rose without the rose itself. And similarly, I get, you know, I can conceive the smell of an apple without the apple itself, meaning like, so one part here is the idea of something that looks like an apple. And another part is the smell, and another part is the taste, and another part is the consistency, right? So, and what he's, and if, I mean, he's using a rose rather than an apple, but he's in fact admitting, like on the next page, is that, yeah, okay, of course I can conceive of these without this. So I have an idea of the smell of the rose. So what is it exactly that Berkeley thinks can't be separated and Locke thinks can be separated? That's the question. So I think actually there's only a few cases that Berkeley singles out where Locke thinks that there's something that can be separated and Berkeley says there isn't. Or at least where Locke thinks that there's a kind of abstraction we can do and Berkeley says there can't because there's nothing to be separated. So like the first one is, but this one is so weird in Locke that it's hard to get anything out of Berkeley's objection. So the first one is abstraction from simple ideas. I mean, so like, for example, and remember, this was what was involved in his critique of the idea, the supposed general idea of human. For example, can we form an idea of color in abstraction from all the particular colors? So Locke certainly thinks we can. And again, it's kind of important because a lot of important general ideas like human have this abstract idea of color as a constituent. So Berkeley says, no, you can't do that. But as I said, that's a really weird case in Locke because however Locke thinks this happens, it's not by separating the two parts of the simple idea. It doesn't have two parts. So when Locke actually talks about the example of color, he says, we are fain to sort them by the, I forget what word he uses, but by the way they come into the mind. Right? So in other words, the abstract idea of color is of an idea that comes in only by the sense of vision. But that's, you know, I mean, that's classifying the idea not by its own content, but by its relation to our faculties. So it's totally different from the usual type of abstraction that Locke talks about. And, you know, and whether Berkeley has an argument against the way Locke actually says it works, I'm not even sure. Okay, so so this could be important again, as you see in the example of human, but it's hard to know like what to say about it because both because it's hard to pin down exactly what Locke thinks about it and why he thinks about this as a type of abstraction, and on the other hand, it's hard to know exactly what position Berkeley thinks he's arguing against. So okay, so here's another one, and this I think is the one that Berkeley spends the most time talking about. So it's abstraction from each other of ideas belonging to the same sense. It's the same sense modality. So one example of this is that Berkeley constantly mentions is color and visible shape. I mean, so actually, again, in this book, Berkeley doesn't distinguish between visual shape and tangible shape, even though based on the other book, he really should. He thinks they're two different, completely different things. And there was a question about that in Locke too, where he also, he often says that we receive, ideas of shape both by vision and by touch. But it doesn't seem like the visible idea of shape could be a primary quality. So, I mean, let me just talk about the type of example, right? So, Locke will say, well, if I have an idea of a white sphere, then it has two parts, white and sphere. And Berkeley will say, no, there's just one idea, a white sphere. And just as you couldn't see, so I mean, of course, you could see white without the spherical shape, but you couldn't see white without any shape. And you couldn't see sphere without any color, although Locke perhaps disagrees with that. Because when he talks about having microscopic eyes, he seems to say that you wouldn't see color, but I don't know what he thinks you would see. But anyway, all right, so going back to Berkeley, right? So just think like just as you can't have a sensible idea of white without shape, you can't then like you can't conceive of white without shape. Right? So the mind can't, again, can't free itself from that limitation of sense. In sensation, we always get color and shape together, and Berkeley says, and therefore shape and color always go together. Now, I mean, what does Locke have to say in response to that? And the answer is, I don't really know. That is, because I guess what Berkeley is pointing out is there seems to be a visible necessary connection between color and visible shape. But color, at least, is definitely not a primary quality according to Locke, and therefore it doesn't have any necessary connections to other simple ideas, or that is, color ideas don't have any obvious necessary connections to other simple ideas. That's also why I said I think that visible shape probably isn't really a primary, isn't the idea of a primary quality, or that Locke should say it's not. So how does Locke explain? But then again, as I said, it's not clear Locke agrees with this. Locke possibly thinks that you can see a shape without color. He certainly talks as if you could. So the visible shape color one, although it's the one Berkeley constantly comes back to, is again one that I'm not sure what to do with. But on the other hand, the one that's super important is the connection between the tangible properties of bodies. And now we can see, right, now I think in this case, there's a clear distinction between what Locke thinks and what Berkeley thinks. So Locke thinks, for example, that solidity always goes together with shape or figure, because there's a visible necessary connection between solidity and figure. I think that's even one of his examples. It's close to one of his examples. So these are completely different ideas. And I can think of each of them separately, but I can see that they require each other. That is, and remember, I argued that's exactly why Locke thinks that we can get some knowledge here about what the external object is like. Right? Because it's not my mind that makes them go together. They intrinsically have to go together, and that means their causes must be such that they always. My mind can consider them apart, but they require each other, and that must be because of their causes, right? So, that's Locke's side. And Berkeley says, now I'm drawing this, but this is supposed to be a tangible sphere, not a visible sphere, right? So I should really like pass it around the room and have you all feel it. Like Berkeley says, no, there's just one idea. There's just one tangible idea. It has all the properties that Locke calls primary qualities, but Berkeley Berkeley rejects that distinction. I think the reason Berkeley rejects that distinction is not because of, well, I mean, I guess I should say, it's both, it's because on the one hand, that distinction is supposed to involve this kind of necessary connection between distinct ideas. And Berkeley thinks there aren't two different ideas to be connected here. There's just one idea. And on the other hand, that distinction is supposed to have to do with what qualities are really in the object, as opposed to only in my representation of the object in my idea. And again, Berkeley thinks there is no object outside my idea. Right? So for both of those reasons, Berkeley, rejects Locke's primary-secondary distinction. However, it's still the case that what Locke calls primary ideas of primary qualities, have a really special status in Berkeley. Namely, there aren't such ideas. Rather, there's certain aspects of single ideas. It has a bulk, figure, a color, solidity, whatever. Now I know, so you were asking before, but wait, if there's just one thing here, how can it have different aspects or something like that? I mean, so first of all, Berkeley does say at some point, even in this reading, he says, it's true, I can consider something only insofar as, right? So he says, I can consider a drawing of a triangle only insofar as it has three sides and ignore the length and whatever. So he definitely thinks you can, so to speak, regard an idea from a certain point of view. But what that actually amounts to, if the idea doesn't really have parts, I don't think I doesn't say anywhere, but I think you can kind of put together what he would say about it. From some things we're going to talk about later. And I think it roughly has to do, it's similar to, I erased that picture, but it's similar to how the one blended snowball has separate qualities in it because it has more than one effect. I think, according to Berkeley, this one idea, can figure in different kinds of chains of other ideas. So it's associated with different other ideas. And so they're all really simple, actually. But they, this is related to what Carnap calls quasi-abstraction for people who are in 125. They're all actually really simple, but by their like relation to each other, we can, like, so to speak, see different aspects within them. But like I said, I think that's an answer that would be available to Berkeley. I don't see that he says that anywhere. Some later people in vaguely this tradition, like Thomas Brown, some other people actually say things like this, but I don't think Berkeley does. Yeah.
Yeah, asking this question with some trepidation, you mentioned the association of ideas, right? So, I mean, and sorry, it's like, I'm a little bit behind, but so like, what's the implications of that? Like, does that mean that like we're on that? Can you unpack that?
Well, I mean, so, it's Locke who says that association of ideas is madness, right? And it's Hume who's going to say that basically all our thought about cause and effect is association of ideas. So it's does that mean it's not madness? Madness comes up at the end of, well, we'll get to this, but anyway, I think it means in a straightforward way, no, obviously that's not madness, that's ordinary thought, right? So like in between, so like Berkeley, I mean, the question is, so Locke wants to distinguish between associations that have just by accident happened to us, right? Like my example of how, like, when I was a baby, I ate cottage cheese and I choked. I just happened to have those two ideas of the taste of cottage cheese and the unpleasant sensation of choking at the same time, right? So Locke wants to distinguish between that and ideas that we found actually go with each other according to some rule, right? And even though in the second case, unless we're talking about primary qualities, that can't rise to the level of knowledge. Like we can't be certain that they always go together because we don't have the principle in the object that's supposed to be causing this constant going together, right? But it can rise to the level of rational judgment, right? Like probability. So there's association of ideas, which is madness, and then there's like induction, which is the foundation of probable judgments about the real world. So Locke, so Berkeley, it's kind of like, no. All right, so Berkeley, according to Berkeley, as we'll see, if two ideas came together in my senses, that's because God caused them to come together. So it's never just an accident. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that, obviously, it's not completely obvious, but Berkeley is certainly much more, as you can tell from that. I guess that's one way that late book about the virtues of tar water does connect to this. Like Berkeley is much more gullible, right? Or like much more open to claims of empirical laws that don't really have much behind them. Like, I don't think Locke would have become convinced that, he basically became tar water as some kind of gross thing that you make by soaking pine sap and then you drink it. And it's supposed to, like, according to Berkeley, it has all these amazing properties. So I don't think Locke would have fallen for that. But nevertheless, obviously Berkeley has to have some way of talking about the difference between I just happen to have the taste of cottage cheese when something unpleasant happened, and actual empirical science. But I mean, I think he has something to say about it, but not that much, because as we'll see, he's not that like, yeah, he's not that much in awe of the capabilities of empirical science. He thinks a lot of it's a waste of time. All right, that's the best that's best answer I can give to that. Okay, so like, this is important. It's important because it gets to the basis of physics and all kinds of other things like that. But I still think it's not the most important case. There's one, there's a third one that I didn't write down in these notes that I should have, which is about pain and pleasure. Because remember, Locke thinks like there's an idea of heat. It comes in different degrees. And in the lower degrees, it's like accompanied by an idea of pleasure. And in the higher degrees, it's accompanied by an idea of pain. So like Berkeley, analyzing the same situation, says that the pain is the intense heat. That is, there aren't two different ideas there. I mean, so like Berkeley says this when he gets it. He doesn't emphasize that this is a disagreement with Locke. Maybe he would have emphasized this in part 2, because this obviously has some kind of implications for ethics. But therefore, I'm going to write it. I'm not going to say anything more about it. But it's nothing. But the last example, I think, is the one that's really important. So there's some very abstract ideas, in particular, being and unity. Now remember, even in Locke, again, this was a weird case. I mean, basically all of these are about weird cases in Locke. Right? None of them are about the, like forming the idea of parrot, because I can think of the color of a parrot with, or, I can think of a, no, what am I saying? I'm getting myself confused. All right, some of these are the usual cases of abstraction. Like I can form the idea of parrot because I can abstract from the fact that some parrots are green and some are blue and some are gray and whatever, right? And form the general idea of parrot. So yeah, Locke says I can have that idea, and Berkeley says I can't. But a lot of the usual cases of abstraction are not like this. Like again, I can form the idea of the smell of a rose. So according to Locke, that seems to be an example of abstraction, but Berkeley says I can do it. So the things they actually disagree about are kind of weird cases. And this one, though, so remember, like, why the weirdness of this in Locke. So first of all, Locke says that these two ideas of being and unity are quote unquote suggested by every idea. So then, okay, in what sense are they separable? They're suggested by every idea. So like, as soon as I separate them off, another one will come, right? Like, I mean, you can see that in reverse when Locke talks about forming the ideas of numbers, where you take 3 units and you put them together. And you might say, oh, so here you have an idea that doesn't have unity, it has triplicity, right? But no, the idea of three results from taking these all together as one. So there's like another idea of unity that comes in as soon as you form an idea. And similarly, when you abstract, you're gonna still have the idea of one species, one quality, whatever. This idea of unity is always gonna come with it. So, so in what sense are they separable? And what I argued kind of in scattered pieces as we discussed Locke, and I'm not sure I ever made it completely, well, I'm sure I didn't ever make it completely clear. And I'm not going to make it completely clear now either. But what I argued basically is that you can separate these ideas out from the fourth type of agreement of ideas. So, like, when the baby first tastes wormwood, why do people choose wormwood? I think there's reasons you do.
Well, to stop it from nursing.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's why you would like smear it on the. All right. Anyway, so, let's not get too graphic. So that, right. So when the baby first tastes wormwood, it has the idea of bitter. And the idea of bitter agrees with the idea of being or existence. Now, what does that mean? So, like, it doesn't mean that bitter necessarily exists, right? That like bitter exists by definition. That would make bitter like God. Right? Like God in Descartes' fifth meditation proof of the existence of God. So like just from having that idea of bitter, you can conclude that there is bitter. So how does it agree with being? And you know, is it just that there's some relationship between it and the idea of being that always holds? There is a relationship between it and the idea of being that always holds, but that relation always holds between every idea and being. Right? And so what I said is that like that being in that sense is possible being, or being at some completely indeterminate time. That's basically the second kind of agreement, right? The first one I was talking about was identity and difference, the first type of right. The second, this is the second kind. The third kind of agreement here, I'm not sure, but it's also wrong for sure. So, right, but the fourth kind of agreement, real existence. So, like, and remember, so the question was, wait, real existence seems to be an existence between my idea and the wormwood. Right? Like the infant's idea correctly represents the wormwood as existing. But it can't be that because Locke says all knowledge is agreement, all propositions, and therefore all knowledge is about agreement and disagreement between ideas, not between ideas and like bushes, right? So, so I said the fourth type of agreement and disagreement is a contingent type of relation between ideas that means bitter, that is the quality that's responsible for bitter, exists at a certain time. And in sensation, that time is now, and in memory, that time is some other time. And sure enough, in that sense too, all simple ideas at least agree with being, because since the mind can't make its own simple ideas, every simple idea is always either a sensation or a memory. right? It's either something that's coming in right now or that's something I remember coming in the past. Although I may not remember exactly when it was that is, I may not remember what else was happening then, but it was at a determinate time. Um, so, okay, so that's like a review of all the weird things I said about Locke and transcendental ideas, although transcendental is not a term. All right, so anyway, so uh, what does it mean that these things can be separated? Well, it means that I can take the idea of bitter away from the idea of existing at a determinate time. So it's still left with the idea, it's still left with a connection to being in the sense that it still represents something as possibly being at some possible time, right? But it no longer represents something as being at any particular time. And when an infant tastes wormwood, the infant is not yet able to do that, right? Infants are not yet capable of abstraction, according to Locke, just as non-human animals, according to Locke, are never capable of abstraction. So, although, again, as I said before, when I mentioned this before, I think if you said to Locke, wait, here, dolphins are capable of abstraction, he would be like, oh, okay, only humans and dolphins, right? Like, isn't that, I mean, so, but according to Locke, only like mature humans are capable of abstraction. So the idea that the infant gets is the idea of bitter here now. And it's a simple idea, but it's not abstract because it still has this connection to existence at a determinate place and time. And what we do later is break that. And that was what I argued, according to Locke, that's the fundamental operation of the mind in abstraction, right? It's not just separating any arbitrary ideas. It's separating, this is book 2, chapter 11, section 9, another section that I kept reading over and over. Page 155. Oh, here it is. The mind makes the particular ideas were seen for particular objects to become general, which is done by considering them as they are in the mind such appearances, separate from all other existences and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. Right? So, like, no matter how complicated an idea is, if it still has this connection to existence at a particular time and place, then it's a particular idea, not an abstract idea. Or sorry, that's backwards. No matter how complicated an idea is, if you've broken the connection to a determinate time and place, right? So that if you could take every quality that this pen has, which we can't, right? According to Locke, we don't know almost any of the qualities that it has. But suppose we knew every single quality that this pen has. We could make a huge idea out of all those qualities. And then if we just broke the connection to a particular time and place, that would be an abstract idea. And on the other hand, this idea, which is very simple, there's nothing left to separate it from it. It's so simple. Nevertheless, making this one connection here makes it particular, not abstract. So this one weird case actually does mean that Berkeley thinks all of what Locke calls abstraction is impossible. So, like, I've, in a sense, like I've built up this weird mystery, like what do they disagree about? They don't just seem to disagree about most of the things that Berkeley is thinking of as abstraction and like what, so, but the truth is, yes, what Locke really calls abstraction, Berkeley thinks is impossible. Because Berkeley, uh, definitely denies that these ideas of being in unity exist. Yeah.
When you have the example then of Berkeley being able to see the shape of the apple and the smell of the apple and all of these different parts, are those then particular recalls of memory, or is there still some like pseudo abstraction that Berkeley commits to?
So, yeah, well, see, I'm going to say, let me get to that later, but I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time. I mean, so again, Berkeley doesn't think that this thing of taking an idea and regarding it as it is in itself in the mind such an appearance, distinct from any time and place, is possible. So every idea is particular. So this idea of the smell of an apple, that let's say I'm smelling an apple right now, I get the idea of the smell of an apple. That's the idea of the smell of this apple right now. Later, I can have another idea, like perhaps when there's no apples around and I'm just walking down the street, I can have the idea of the smell of an apple. So that's a different particular idea. Um, but it does have something in common with the other idea. And then to explain what it means that something has something in common, again, like Berkeley is going to say, like, so like when Berkeley explains how a geometrical proof works, he says, suppose I'm trying to prove that we just go back to Locke's example, right? Like I'm trying to prove that these angles add up to two right angles. So what my proof actually proves is that these particular angles add up to these angles, right? But then Berkeley says, but I can notice that in the proof, I never mentioned the length of the sides or the time and place in which the triangle exists or the color of the lines or any of those things, right? So I can notice that those things played no role in the proof. And therefore, I know that I can use this same proof on any triangle, right? This proof is good for all triangles. So, I'm doing this in the wrong order. I mean, that's both the good and the bad thing of our questions. To scramble the order. But so, I mean, the question here is, wait, isn't that just abstraction? Right? I mean, it's the same question that comes up when Berkeley, so like Berkeley's explanation, why did everyone think they had this power when they didn't? So Berkeley says, well, it has something to do with language, right? They thought that, and again, they just turns out to mean Locke, right? They thought every significant word had to stand for some single idea. And so since some words can be applied to many different particulars, they thought, that is Locke thought, that must happen because I have a general idea, right? And then he quotes Locke saying that. But Berkeley says, in fact, the same word, a word becomes general by being used for many different particulars. Now, I mean, and that's basically the same thing that's going on here, right? Like this triangle is a particular, but I use it for many different other particulars, right? It's like a word. So, and the question is, and this is what, so nominalists who think that, I feel weird about introducing that term again here without time to explain how it's related to the other way I used it before. But like people who think, as Berkeley is saying here, that we have universal words, but not universal ideas, right? Like the argument that always comes back against them is something like, but wait, how do you know? Like, here's my word. Like, suppose I have it written on a piece of paper, so here's my word triangle. And I go along with my word, and how do I know which things correspond to my word and which don't? Isn't there something, there's a rule, right? There's a rule I'm using to decide which things are triangles and which are not. I'm not doing it by comparing them to the word. That's an arbitrary sign. And even if this card has a picture of a triangle on it, I'm not doing it by comparing them to the triangle, because in that case, if you started with different triangles, pictures of different triangles, you might get a different result, right? Like only the ones that are like this one. So the rule is not either the picture of the triangle or the word. And isn't the rule the real universal? So you actually do have a universal somewhere. So I think Berkeley's answer to this is there is something universal, but it's not an idea. There's a universal principle of your will. Now we haven't gotten to describe it to like what Berkeley is going to say about the active power of spirits, which is what a will is, right? So we'll talk about that next time. But it's completely different from an idea. And in particular, it can't be represented by ideas. That is, there's nothing analogous to, whereas in Locke, if I have the idea of a triangle, there's something outside me that's analogous to it. And that's why I can represent it using this triangle. According to Berkeley, there's no analogy between my idea and the active power of the spirit. Which is much to say is as much as to say the spirit has no primary qualities. So what there is here, and I'm sorry, I know we have to go, but let me just finish one last sentence. Maybe I guess I'll say something at the beginning next time about this. What we have here, according to Berkeley, is like the rule of my will is a syntactic rule. It's like a grammatical rule, right? It says like when you get something like this, you're allowed to exchange it for something else like this. And then you're allowed to exchange that and exchange that. And then and then you come out with a result at the end. So and what justifies that is not like a way that all of these things are analogous to what's really happening in the object. That would be a semantic rule, right? What justifies that is just this is the rule I've set up to try to track what actually happens to me. And thank God sometimes it works. With thank God being very literal there. All right, I will see you next week.